Hi everyone, marhaban, welcome. We will start the talk tonight. There are a few more people coming in. Have a seat. All right. Well, welcome to Yas SeaWorld Research and Rescue Center. I am Dr. Elise Marquis, and I thank you all for attending to this new science talk. As you know, this series of science talk at the center is developed in partnership with the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi, the Emirates Natural History Group Abu Dhabi, the Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi, and Nautica Environmental Associates. And I'm very happy to see many of the people from the different teams tonight. I am personally very excited about the topic of tonight's talk. And actually, last month, which was only 2-3 weeks ago, last month's talk was about sea turtles, so we are not going so far. We are staying with the reptiles. We will be talking about reptiles, but mostly on land. So we will get out of the water and spend a bit of time in our beautiful region of the Arabian Peninsula. And we will be looking at species that have mastered living in harsh conditions of the deserts and the mountains of our region. We will be talking about snakes, lizards, and of course, and without forgetting my ultimate favorites, the geckos. Needless to say that I'm very honored to have two eminent reptile experts, herpetologists, tonight with us, Johannes Hels and Dr. Drew Gardner. As usual, please keep your question for the end, as we will have a Q&A question after the two talks. But without any further ado, let me welcome Johannes Hels on stage. Just to introduce Johannes quickly, Johannes leads the Herpetology and Freshwater Fishes Department at the Arabian Wildlife Center in Sharjah, Emirates. He discovered, actually, maybe I should not spoil that, but he did discover this gecko, one gecko species in the UAE, and received the Sheikh Mubarak bin Mohammed Al Nahyan Award last year, in 2023. Yes, exactly. He has also co-authored several books, and I'm sure you can Google his name and you will find all the books online, and worked on films like Wild Arabia, which I recommend if you haven't seen, and Death by Dawn. But here you go, Johannes.
Thank you. Good evening. It's very nice to see a big crowd. I was actually anticipating to have far less people. Tonight I'm going to give an overview of the biodiversity of reptiles within the Arabian Peninsula. And most people, when they think about desert environments, is automatically it's a monotonous landscape with very low diversity. But it's not true. Arabia actually, when it comes to reptiles, has one of the highest diversities for the area and the desert environment, and several species that's so specially adapted for each of these little microenvironments that they occupy. And this is just to give an overview. I cannot obviously go into detail on all the different species, but to highlight some of the endemics that we've got in the peninsula and also the islands. So if you look at the map on the screen now, this is from 242 species of reptiles. And this is going to increase by the end of the year. With several new species that's currently being described and should be published towards the end of the year and early next year. Several of them, including the encryptus species, which then incorporates things like the semaphore geckos, the pasturas. And as you look, the distribution and the records that we got is fairly comprehensive for Arabia, with a high density, obviously, on the west and then the east, which is associated with the mountain ranges. So on the Hajar Mountains on the east, which extends through the Muslim Peninsula, through the UAE, and down south into Oman. And then we have the Dhofar Mountains in Oman, which is an isolated range with also high endemicity. And then your Ashia Mountains, which then extends through from Saudi into Yemen. Now, the Arabian Peninsula, I'm going to group together in one area. Is the Reptiles, or the empty quarter. And we do have several species that do occur there. The diversity is lower compared to, obviously, the mountain ranges. And one of these geckos that extend into the empty quarter onto your salt flats and also along the coastal areas is the subkite gecko. It's a single genus in Arabia, so it's a unique species as well represented when it comes to diversity, with special adaptations for occupying areas of higher salinity. Drew will obviously discuss this later on in his talk in more detail, but it's a good example of one species that actually are able to survive in really arid and extreme environments. If we go into the south of Oman, the Circus Sands is one of the well-known isolated large inland deserts. And we got two species that stands out that's endemic there. One is what most people know as the web-footed gecko, which is one of the really smallest geckos that you find in sandy dune environments. And this particular one is a species that's endemic to the Circus Sands area. And it got some differences between the normal Arabian wet-footed gecko, which is widespread, by comparing the webbing on the feet and several other morphological characteristics. In this isolated desert environment, we also got a toad-headed agama species, which only occurs in the Circus Sands area. Then if we start looking into the Tahima Desert towards Saudi Arabia and the south of Yemen, we got several isolated endemic species and subspecies which do not occur anywhere else. One of them is a sandfish species, the Himbridge sandfish, which only occurs in this narrow coastal strip along the Red Sea. Also Stanidactylus yemenensis, which extends down into Yemen, and then Cerastes huffiniae, or the Hufini's horn viper. It's the only Cerastes or the horn viper species, which is related to the North African horn vipers that occur in Arabia, and closely related, obviously, to the well-known Arabian horn viper or sand viper, as people are familiar with. The Hufini's horn viper is not very well known when it comes to ecology and studies. We've only in recent times been able to sample them and have a look at how are they related to the species up in North Africa. If we then progress to the Hajar Mountains in the east, then our level of endemic species increased significantly. And this will reflect, obviously, in the talk that Drew will cover on geckos, which comprises the majority of the species. And then one of the iconic one is Sarcus montanus, which is thanks to Drew's work in the early years in Oman that he discovered in 1991, 94. And Drew described this gecko from Jebel Akhtar in Oman, which now obviously in recent time genetics has also revealed the uniqueness of this species in the Hajar Mountains, adapted to very high altitudes. And it's a species that's a good example to study for climatic changes over the years, because some of the populations are already at high altitudes with no ability to actually extend the range further up. So it's a species that's highly threatened by climate change over time, and something that should be a priority for future research. We got the Hajar carpet viper, or the Hajar saw-scale viper, which we recently took the advantage to rename them a new English name as such. They endemic to the Hajar Mountains and occur nowhere else. And also a Monosaurus, or what we call the Jacquard lizards and the blue-tailed lizards, which are endemic to these mountains. And it's a genera that is not occurring anywhere else in the the world. In particular, when we look at things like the J-car lizards, ecologically they are quite important for these ecosystems in the mountains, and they most likely also contribute with pollinating and distributing seeds of plants. They are omnivorous, so they will consume both invertebrates and then plant material. So Hajar Mountains has obviously got a very interesting geological formations from the north in the Musandam with carbonated rock, which doesn't allow any accumulation of surface water, which then also influence in the distribution of several of the species throughout the range, and then also cause several species to be isolated due to elevations, as well as then your formation and geological history of the mountains. In the south, in Oman and Dhofar, it becomes really interesting because this is an area that we got several African-related species that's isolated within the Dhofar Mountains. For example, the puffadder, which is widely distributed through Yemen and Saudi Arabia in the Asher Mountains, but we got a distribution gap between the south and Oman ranging into Yemen, and then puffadders again occur from Djibouti and then south into Africa as well, where they are fairly common. Now, there's several species that's again endemic. One of them is what we call a burrowing asp. It's a venomous snake in the last bottom page, and this is a species that has not been studied very well ecologically wise, but we started discovering now quite a few of them recently, and also the expansion of development and ecotourism in the region. And it's a species that's endemic, that requires more in-depth studies, being a venomous snake. Thus, we are interested to know on venom proteins, how many people potentially get bitten by them, because it is a snake in Africa that is responsible for several bites, as they look fairly harmless and people tend to pick them up and get a nasty surprise when the snake stabbed them. Invasive species is also a problem in Arabia. In Dhofar, we're currently facing a severe problem with the Asian garden lizard that has been introduced decades back, but the range is currently expanding quite dramatically throughout Dhofar. It's not an isolated case. We also got the garden lizards now introduced all over several of the Indian Ocean islands, for example, Rodriguez and Mauritius, and they're extremely good colonizers. So this is another introduced species that we are currently flagging to monitor and determine what is the impact. Our preliminary results from several colleagues are indicating that there is a potential that they're impacting the local chameleon populations without competing the chameleons, obviously, for food resources. They are territorial, so it's a study that needs to be followed up to see to what extent they have an impact on especially the endemic species. The Asher mountain range, which extends from Saudi Arabia in the south down to Yemen, comprises again of several species that's quite unique to Arabia and endemic. When it comes to venomous snakes, we got the saw-scale viper, the Burkini saw-scale viper, which is endemic along the coastline and the low-altitude mountain ranges, which is not studied very well, and obviously from a venom research point of view, it is very interesting for us to look at how this species compares with other saw-scale vipers in the region. Now, the desert monitor is pretty well known for most people. Most people have seen desert monitors at some point in Arabia, but the least known of them all is actually one of the larger and the most endemic monitor lizard, which is called the Yemen monitor. It got a very interesting story. It is also commonly known in the biological circles as the TV monitor, as the person that discovered it was actually watching an old documentary that was recorded by BBC, and he noticed the monitor in the program, which then sparked out that this is potentially something new, and that led then to the discovery of the second monitor species for Arabia. They're fairly closely related to some of the African species, and it's not a desert environment, and that's where a lot of people forget that Arabia is not a monotonous, dry environment. The Asher Mountains, including the Hajar Mountains, experience much higher rainfall, particularly Dhofar, as you have seen. Currently, it's monsoon season, and it's green and a lush environment. So that creates a space and a microclimates for a lot of other species that can occupy these niches. Overlook terrapin species. A lot of people think about turtles. But we got a species that's even more threatened than some of our marine turtles. And this is a species that was commonly known before as just the masked terrapin, an African masked terrapin. And with genetic research and also morphological characteristics being compared with African species, it is now known that this is a distinct endemic species to Arabia. That's only found in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And we've done a preliminary draft assessment for the species and also a monograph looking at the natural history and compiling all the information with colleagues that's based in Yemen and Saudi Arabia to compile at least as much as possible information on the current population trends. So this is a species that's a good example that will be overlooked, and it's the only one of two species of freshwater turtles in Arabia. The other one is the more widespread Caspian terrapin, which you find along the east coast of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, and then the endemic marsh terrapin. And this species, if most people we're going to ask, they're going to say, well, there's no turtles in Arabia. Yes, there are. And it's endemic, which got a really high conservation priority for actions and future follow-up. So the Asher Mountains typically is also fairly green, lower temperatures, higher rainfall, as I mentioned, with obviously several species like baboons and other African mammals. And this is a very nice example of a study that one of our colleagues are currently busy with, showing how interesting Arabia actually is. We got a huge influence of species that originated from Africa along the west of Arabia, and then on the east of Arabia got a large influence again with species that was isolated and historical languages with Asian species, and in separation, especially along the coast of Iran. And this is a very good example, as I mentioned, with the puffadder. Puffadder is very well known in Africa, but they isolated in Arabia. Genetically, it seems to be quite a recent event. They have not separated into subspecies or different species. And then we got a huge gap between the south of Yemen into the Dhofar region. Why that is still a big question mark, and still research that hopefully will reveal this as we start developing and doing genomic research, which is revealing us quite a lot of interesting information. The Persian horned viper is another very good example of a reptile species that has an Asian origin. And it's one of the only vipers, except for the puffadder, which is also down in Oman, that breathes when it hisses to warn people, where a lot of our true desert-adapted species rub their scales as a warning sign. This species is fairly common as you cross over run into the Zagros Mountains. Then Socotra cannot be overlooked. Socotra is part of the Arabian Peninsula, and it's one of several islands that we got, but Socotra is particularly interesting to name. It's basically got 100% endemic reptile species diversity. And in this little gecko, I think the common name I'll refer to as the blood dragon tree gecko for the average people. And this gecko is really important actually for pollinating the blood trees, dragon blood trees in Socotra. So it's a species, if it goes extinct, it will also have an impact on your flora in the area. So the overview of all the species, as you can see in one slide, 31 species that's endemic to Socotra, which is really unique as well. And it's not something that you can say in most islands. I think Drew can can vouch for it, not even on some of the East African islands, we do not see the level of endemism like we will notice on Socotra. Referring to Socotra, we also include then the 2 other small islands associated with Socotra as well. Terrestrial snakes is obviously my strong point and my focus. That is my main interest, particularly looking at venomous snake distributions in Arabia and the impact they have with people, and then looking at mitigation solutions. And it's also the group of reptiles which is probably the most difficult to manage when it comes to convincing people that they are part of the biodiversity and needs to be conserved. Most people's attitude towards snakes are, can they not just be wiped out? We don't need them. So snakes are quite important to study, obviously, in the region for ecological benefits that they do comprise in the ecosystem, and to try and educate people. Currently, we're doing a lot of interesting work and looking at studying snake ecology, as well as comparing it with what other colleagues are doing, and trying to convince people. So for me at the moment, a lot of the people are normally calling you to remove a snake. We are trying now to educate people that we should rather not remove the snake from where it is. If it's something that's in the house or in direct contact that it poses a threat to someone, yes, to move it away, but not to catch it and relocate it. So in the old days, there's quite a lot of people that promote their snake catchers and they're doing conservation. No, they're not. They're releasing the snakes and moving them away kilometers, and the snakes actually just die and no one knows what's happening. So we're trying now to change the attitude towards let people understand what is the threat, what is the benefit of actually keeping the snake in there, in the home range that it knows, and several benefits that it will have around, and the negative impacts. And we slowly have some change in attitudes and acceptance where people allow us to release snakes back into their gardens. For example, the sand snakes, which most people encounter. So instead of removing them, they become permanent residents in the area. So distributions for snakes are also following a similar pattern to the overall biodiversity in Arabia. It's not as large a diversity as compared to your geckos that you will have, or other lizard species and agamarts in Arabia. Out of this range of species, within Arabia, there's only 15 species which is considered medically important. I use the phrase medically important venomous snakes because there are several species that do got venom, but venom is a very complex molecule that comprises of different components. And to tell the average people that a sand snake is venomous creates more panic than actually educating them. So to keep it simple, it's a medically venomous snake, which means if it bites you, you're going to require medical treatment and intervention. So that's the easiest frame to explain it to the average person on the street. I'm going to narrow it down, having an overview of what is the diversity within Arabia, is to look a little bit what is within the UAE, what is on our doorstep. And we also got a really interesting diversity and selection of species, including the only endemic vertebrate in the UAE, which is a gecko. It's just obviously not as well known as other animals because it's not a furry, cuddling thing that got a human bond or interaction, or got nice glowing eyes that stare back at you. So they tend to stare and not get the necessary attention that they deserve in a lot of conservation plannings or support from the public. Now, the information and the content that we develop here is a lot based on several herpetologists in Arabia that work together, including Drew's years of work previously that created the foundation for us in Oman and UAE. And from that, several surveys were made and grid systems in the country to survey and look at different gaps to compile the data. Now, I'm not going to go too much in, but this is just a slide that I normally show everyone that, look, it's actually really diverse in the UAE. Where you go, there's so many different habitats. Each one of those, if you go and you tell me you have not seen a single animal, you have not spent enough time, or you've been in the the wrong place. So incredibly diverse, from marine turtles on the coast and geckos living on the beaches, amphibians in the wadis, freshwater fish, we name it. It's a high diversity, interesting plant life, invertebrates by the thousands. Species richness, again, if we look, when you move towards the east of the country, towards the Hajar Mountains, it is, again, higher rainfall and also lower temperatures on average, and the diversity increase. And this includes also then a majority of the gecko species. As we start progressing towards Abu Dhabi, up north, it is a much more dry environment, higher temperatures, and that's where we start seeing species like the Egyptian spiny-tailed or the small-scaled spiny-tailed agama, which occurs this side of the country, and then the endemic leptine spiny-tailed lizard, which occurs towards the mountains with high rainfall. So even climatic spaces within the country is really diverse, and that influences the distribution of a lot of the reptile species. A few years back, myself and Drew and several other colleagues were responsible for doing the reptile red list for the UAE, the national red list. So how the red lists normally work is we had 10 years back a national red list where we assess all the species for Arabia, looking at their status and identifying endemic species. Then we scale it down, what we call a national red list, and we look then at the species within the country. Now, you can have a species that is globally least concerned. Then you can have a species which is within Arabia and endemic to Arabia, but it occurs in several countries, which can be then a species that potentially vulnerable because of several threats to the species. And then we go down to a national level and we look at, for example, just within the UAE border, the populations that occur within the country. What is the threats and the status and the distribution of that species within it? And that can either trigger then a species being a higher conservation threat or lower, or also least concern. So that was a very important first step that the UAE took as an initiative to assess the reptiles and also several of the other taxa. Overall, it's been fairly good, majority of the species being least concern, but we had 2 species of reptiles that flagged off obviously as critically endangered. We got a range of protected areas which covers most of the species, reptile species in the UAE. A problem with protected areas, not just within the country, but also globally, as a lot of protected areas do not necessarily protect endangered species or species that is threatened. And that's where it's a good example to look at this, where we try to also advocate people that conservation is not really something that's restricted to your protected areas and nature reserve. It starts in the backyard and also landscaping, your development of cities as well to incorporate it. And by practicing that and networking that through with protected areas and linking a network as such, that's the only way we can actually protect endangered species. And there's several examples where we actually got more endangered species surviving and living within urban environments rather than into protected areas. So geckos, I'm going to run just briefly through. Drew is going to touch on all the interesting details. We got a high diversity of geckos with 21 species, and this excludes now species that we have considered as introduced. Introduced species can sometimes be quite tricky to decide if they're introduced or not, and we look at when more or less the first records or occurrence of the species was noted within the country. The semaphore geckos is an interesting group which Drew will discuss further, but this is a group that you will see in the coming year or 2 that's going to diversify with a description of at least 8 to 9 new species throughout the Hajar mountain range. It's a very tiny gecko, looks very similar to one another and what we refer to as cryptic species. These geckos were studied, each of them, as the name referred, semaphore signaling, got a unique way of communicating with each other. They're also isolated with elevations and different climatic zones throughout the Hajar mountains. And if you really take time to look at a gecko, that's about 2 to 3 centimeters long, you start picking up small morphological changes. But thanks to genetics, it started to help to note a lot of these differences much quicker and understanding the evolution of these geckos. The yellow-bellied house gecko is obviously one that's been introduced in the country, and that's a good example of a species that everyone sees. And it's the only true gecko that's associated in Arabia really with houses. And some of them do adapt, but this is a classic example of how people actually can influence the distribution of certain species. And this is a species that colonize very quickly, and you will see them in new urban areas that develop. But they do not pose a threat to the environment compared to, for example, the garden lizards that was introduced in the south of Oman that actually are able to colonize natural areas. This gecko we will not consider as a species that's necessarily invasive. It's introduced, but it's not a species that has an impact on our native geckos. They do not survive, and they do not extend further from urban areas. Then the most important gecko is the Emirati leaf-toed gecko. This is a species that were originally discovered by Nick Arnold, and Drew, obviously, in his years here as well, has worked on it and described and recorded several of these species. And this led in the last decade to look at genetics and looking also on a note that Drew and Nick Arnold noted originally on some differences in this gecko, which then led to the follow-up and genetic work that was done with it, including now with our colleague Salvador Carranza, that done the first genome sequence for a reptile in Arabia. And it became very clear that this is the only endemic vertebrate for the country, which occurs in isolated populations along the east coast. It is highly fragmented populations with high levels of inbreeding, unfortunately, due to population declines. And one of the species that now several conservation actions are being done, including protecting actually several of the key habitats along the coast. The next one is the wonder gecko, or some call them also the frog-eyed geckos. Now, this is not an endemic species to Arabia. They occur in Iran, where they diversify into several other different species. But for Arabia, the UAE is the only country where they occur. We have mapped historical data, including Drew's original groundwork that he done on the species, and done this over several years to follow up how the species is impacted by development, as they are quite sedentary. So that means if they get a burrow and they are in the area, they tend to stay there unless the area gets destroyed. And overlapping development with the records that we got and then in-field surveys, we saw a significant decline of at least 60% of the habitat. This led into, again, genetic work to look at how the populations that exist, what is the genetic variability within those populations, and that resulted into a conservation action plan, which is also then the first for the UAE to establish a conservation action plan for something that is not a mammal. And we had several success stories that led to it, including the first establishment of a protected area specifically for gecko, Misnat in Sharjah. And then we had also recently, if I'm correct, one of the protected areas in Abu Dhabi that also include the species now. Lizards, 10 species, quite diverse. As I mentioned in the Hajar Mountains, this is the Manassoi sayonara, or the blue-tailed lizard. It's one of the most colorful lizards, I will say, in Arabia, and especially in this region. And if you compare that with the babies are incredibly colorful, and they change colors from being blue and striped into these beautiful cryptic gray and blue colors. And a lot of people will think these are extremely rare, but they are very common, especially those that go hiking in Wadi Shalka. If you spend time and you sit around, you will start seeing these little small lizards popping out everywhere in the cracks. But they're quite shy, so if you move around, they disappear, and then once they see danger has passed, they come out. But they're fairly common throughout most of their distribution range. Then agamarets, we got 6 species in UAE. Some of them are are fairly well known with Arabian endemic, which is the yellow spotted or the Reptiles. We've got several Reptiles species now also in Saudi Arabia, which is endemic, which is mostly associated with more the sandy environments. And then the Haja endemic, which is the what we call the pseudo-Reptiles or the rock agamas, which is a species that's a good example that's adapted to rocky environments. And they're one of the only lizard species that's actually active in the middle of the day. When it's cooking hot, 50 degrees Celsius, they elevate their bodies off and use their thin legs to actually get away from the radiation from the heat. Skinks is very low, 6 species. Some of the skinks in Arabia as well can be tricky with identification. We actually got 2 species of sandfish. One is the Arabian sandfish, which is fairly common and widespread. And then we've got a species that looks very similar, but they occupy different habitats. They're normally in areas of more compact soil along the coast and not soft sand. And they look more or less similar. So for someone, if I put 2 photos up here and tell me the difference, if this is a common sand skink or Arabian sandfish, no one will know. Obviously, one in the mountains, which is fairly common but also overlooked because it's always within thick vegetation, is a tessellated skink. Then oxalated skink, I think most people have seen these in their gardens. This is also a species that is been debated if they are native or not. Their origins seem to suggest that they are from the Mediterranean and been introduced into Arabia through the development of urban areas coming in with pot plants. And that's why when we do surveys, most of these you will not see in the desert and the sand dunes or in the mountains. They are always restricted within urban gardens. Then we have a worm lizard, Amphispinates. We got 1 species, Zorytnes worm lizard, which is a legless lizard in Arabia. The only other second species is one that occurs in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And this is something that most people will find in their gardens and think it's a very dangerous snake. And it's, again, something that actually is quite helpful for gardeners by predating on invertebrates. Then the desert monitor, the only species that we find in the UAE. And then, as I've said, the other Arabian endemic is our Yemen monitor. They're fairly widespread as well. Snakes, we got 13 species of snakes in the UAE. Again, with a few interesting ones. Arabian cat snake, again, withdrew maybe now 10, 15 years back. We published a paper with the first confirmed records of them in the Hajar Mountains. They were not as well known, but with surveys now, they tend to also be fairly common in most of the areas as well. They're restricted in areas where there's relatively more permanent water, but as you progress down into the south of the Hajar Mountains, they decrease, but they're not as common as a lot of the other snake species. Again, in UAE, I'll put a little bit of emphasis on this because there's a question I get from a lot of people on what is the venomous snakes in the area. So we only got 4 venomous snakes in the country, and I think compared to other countries, it's fairly easy to identify what is actually something that's a potential threat for someone. 1 species occurs in the sand desert environments, which is the Arabian horned viper, and it's one of the only venomous snakes also you find in and around Abu Dhabi. Then the saw scale viper, which is another species that's fairly widespread but absent from the mountains. So that makes it quite easy to distinguish when someone actually gets bitten in the country, what is the potential that he has been bitten by either one of the 2. Once you get into the Hajar Mountains, you got, again, the Hajar saw scale viper or the carpet viper that are referred to. This is a species which there is no anti-venom for, but we do see quite severe envenomation in some of the cases reported. Then the Persian horned viper is the 4th and the final one. This is a species that most people don't really encounter. We have no reports of people being bitten in the country, including a man. It's very rare that you hear anything. It's also a very interesting species. It's one of the only snakes that we got in the country or within the Hajar Mountains that within a species you can determine more or less from which part of the Hajar Mountains they originate from, as the color range and more or less matter of the substrate in those areas. And that's an overview from my side. If you have any questions, then I think afterwards we'll shoot away. No?
Well, thanks for that, Johannes. Question, keep them for the end. We'll have time for those. I'm just going to welcome Dr. Drew Gardner now. And it's a real honor to have him tonight. As Johannes mentioned several times, he's been in the region and studying all the reptiles of the Arabian region for 30 years now. Drew works on agroecology, mangrove restoration, and Hajar Mountains Wildlife Project right now, but he has authored over 50 research publications and is a life member of the Emirates Natural History Group. So welcome, Drew, and let's talk about gecko now.
Thank you, Elise. So, yeah, I'm going to narrow it right down and only talk about the UAE and only talk about the geckos. So, Johannes has given us a very broad picture of Arabian reptiles. It's one which has been evolving very rapidly. The number of species that we know has really increased over the last 10 to 15 years due to genetic work and DNA studies. And that's true also of the geckos. What you see here is the dune sand gecko, one of our common geckos in sandy habitats. You find it really right through the sand deserts of the UAE. And it's quite an odd-looking gecko in a way. It's not many people's idea of what a gecko should look like, and that it's standing right up on its legs very high. It's got its tail arched over its back, pretending it's a scorpion to maybe scare you away. So this is really what everyone thinks of as geckos, and these are the geckos you see in the houses in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai and places. They're very common. It's almost certainly an introduced species, and as Johanna says, it doesn't move into natural habitats, but it's colonized buildings very well. And like many geckos, it is really a fantastically adapted little animal, particularly its climbing abilities. Hang on, I've jumped a few, I think. Okay, I think I'm missing a picture. Anyway, never mind. They are really good at climbing on all surfaces, whether it's kind of up the walls or up on glass. They can even walk on the ceiling quite well because of their climbing, their really fantastic climbing abilities associated with their feet. But not all geckos have those kind of sticky pads. And there's a whole range of different kinds of geckos that we find here in the UAE. We have 22 species of geckos which are recorded here. And when you think that the total number of terrestrial reptiles in the UAE is about 60 species, that's, it's over a third of them are geckos. So we really are sort of gecko central here. And probably even more so if you move into Oman. There's a whole range of different ones there. If you look at the names of these geckos, one thing that stands out is a lot of them have dactylus in the name. So we have Hemidactylus and Trachydactylus and Stenodactylus and Trigonodactylus, Pseudoceramodactylus, and so on. And that's because dactylus means fingers. And geckos generally are kind of classified and often identified by the structure of their fingers. They're very, very varied. So Hemidactylus kind of means of half fingers, or Stenodactylus means thin fingers, which is slightly a misnomer, I think. Trigonodactylus is triangular fingers, and so on. So when you go through the talk, we'll talk a little bit in detail about their feet and what to look for when you're trying to identify some of these geckos, particularly at the generic level. You can also see that we have 3 different families of geckos here. Now, 10 years ago or so, we put them all into one family, which was the Geckonidae, and all geckos basically were kind of thought of as that. But now we know that within the geckos there are different families, and we have 3 of these families here. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of those. So geckos' feet, as I said, are very, very varied. And many geckos have these pads which allow them to climb. The actual mechanism that the pads adhere onto surfaces is really interesting and has been heavily studied over the last 20 years or so, because a gecko can climb on all sorts of different surfaces. It can climb on glass or on rock or on trees or whatever, and it sticks on. And that ability to stick onto things is something which has really fascinated scientists. For example, one of the largest geckos, which is the tokay gecko from Southeast Asia, it's been heavily studied, and it's found that the adhesive force which it can give is equivalent to about 130 kilos. In other words, its toes could hold 130 kilos weight, whereas the gecko is only about maybe 200 grams or so. So in a way, they're really over-engineered, and most geckos can actually hang from one finger. So the adhesion abilities are really fantastic. We can maybe talk about that later on if we have time. But you can see that the shape of the toes is very different. So at the top there, we have something like the tokay, which has big, flat scancers, they're called, the adhesive pads on the toes. Whereas at the bottom left, we have one which has twin little pads on each toe. It's a typical leaf-toed gecko. The yellow one is the hemidactylus, like the house gecko that we have here, with the sort of divided scancers. Over on the far right, but at the bottom, you see one which doesn't have any pads at all, which, in fact, the majority of the geckos here in the UAE don't have climbing pads because they don't live on surfaces where that would be useful. So to go through the geckos, we have the house geckos. We have 3 species. This is the genus Hemidactylus. Over on the right is the yellow-bellied house gecko, which is the common one in buildings. On the left there, we have Hemidactylus robustus, or the Red Sea gecko. And this is also actually found quite commonly on houses in Abu Dhabi. And I have my house in Mushrif. Both of these species are there and actually come into the house as well. It's much smaller and it's got a much rougher sort of skin, and it's got those kind of spotty markings. So if you have geckos in your around your building or your villa or whatever, have a look, and you should maybe be able to identify both these species. The yellow-bellied one's got very smooth skin. The Red Sea gecko is much rougher. And then at the bottom we have the Persian house gecko, which in Iran actually is a house gecko and lives in houses, but it doesn't in the UAE. It's actually quite a rare species here, found in only a few localities. There are some records of them living on buildings in Dubai, but it's not a common species. And then this is another species of gecko, which is found usually associated with humans as well. This is the rough bent-toed gecko, or rough-tailed bent-toed gecko, it's sometimes called. You can see on its back it's got these large scales, which are known as tubercles, but they're very regularly arranged, both longitudinally and horizontally. And it's got kind of kinked toes. And these ones you can find in Abu Dhabi, for example, but in areas usually on the ground, often in industrial areas or around the port or whatever. But I have seen them in my garden in Mushrif as well, so they're quite widespread. But you can see its toes there, no adhesive pads. It doesn't have climbing pads. But that's not to say that it can't climb, because it's got little claws on the end of its toes, and it's quite good at climbing on walls as well, but not nearly as good as the adhesive padded geckos. And this one looks actually very similar, the Baluch ground gecko, but it's also got a lot of these rough tubercles. But this is a species you find very, very commonly in desert areas, not wind-blown sand dunes, but in kind of harder surface desert and sand sheets and so on. Very common. It's also very good at climbing into vegetation, but it doesn't have adhesive pads. And another one, which again looks very similar, is one of the endemics to the Hajar Mountains. When we say endemic, what that word actually means, it's only found in a certain space. So you can say an animal is endemic to a country, such as the Emirates leaf-toed gecko, which is only found in UAE and not in any other country. But many of our species here are endemic to the Hajar Mountains, which we share with Oman. So it's not endemic to the country, but it is endemic in the Hajar Mountains. And this is one of them. This is a particularly pale one. They're usually much more heavily banded than that. That one's on Jebel Hafit. This is the guy we met earlier on, the dune sand gecko. It's one of my favorite geckos. If you go out in the sand dunes at night, you're very likely to see this one. And they tend not to run away. They're quite tame, particularly on a cooler evening, and they'll stand up high like this, and you can go right up to them. Among the other sand geckos, you can usually recognize this one because it's got these white spots on the side. And it too has interesting feet. If you look at them very closely, you see the toes have fringes of scales which stick out on either side. And the kind of idea is that this probably gives them better grip on the loose sand that they live in, maybe for digging, but also for walking on soft sand. This is something that geckos, as do all reptiles do, is they shed their skins. And it's quite interesting that when they do this, they maybe do it every few months. And not only do they shed the skin like you can see here, but it also sheds the spectacle which covers the eye, because geckos don't have eyelids, they don't blink. At least the geckos we have here don't. And so that transparent scale has to be shed as well. But also they shed the skin on the underside of their feet, including all the specialized structures which allow geckos to climb, or this one with its little fringes or whatever. And they develop new skin underneath, of course. Now, among the sand geckos, we have a few species here. That one, the dune sand gecko, is common and a really nice one to see in the dunes. This guy is found on much harder surfaces, particularly in the northern Emirates, the eastern sand gecko. And it doesn't really move into the soft sand dunes or anything. It's found on harder surfaces and often near the coast or the base of the mountains as well. Whereas this one, Sleven's sand gecko, again prefers harder surfaces, but this one, its range is really within the country, is through Abu Dhabi, and it just gets into Dubai, but doesn't go very far into the Northern Emirates or anything. It's just an Abu Dhabi and Dubai one. But you do find them around here. For example, I found this one at near the Al Reef villas on the bit of desert there. You can find this species, along with other sand geckos as well. And this one is perhaps the most interesting one of all. This is the web-footed sand gecko that we have here, which again lives in soft sand and sand dunes. And its front feet, as you can see, are very specialized. Their toes are webbed, and that means that they can use this kind of like snowshoes, if you like, to go onto the soft sand, but particularly for digging their burrow. So they act like little shovels when it's digging as well. These are tiny little geckos, and people often think that they're babies because they're really small. But this is an adult. You can see the size of the sand grains behind it, so it shows how small it is. And you can see that white patch in its abdomen. That's an egg. These ones, they only lay a single egg at a time. And you can see the egg is really large, even compared to its body size. So this is a female, pregnant female. And the last of the sand geckos we have here is one which Johannes also mentioned, something called the Gulf sand gecko, or the Sabka sand gecko, or the Sabka gecko, I suppose would be better to call it, which again is highly specialized. These ones live in saline plains and salty gravel areas and so on near the coast and inland on the Sabkas, which is a really inhospitable area. Almost no plants grow in those areas. The surface, of course, is very, very salty. There's often not very much in the way of shade or anything like that. But these hardy little fellows can live on that, and they can reach really quite high densities sometimes. And their feet also are specialized in that the scales underneath them have little spiny structures, and it's thought that this allows it to move on this kind of quite sticky, salty mud without this sand all sticking onto their feet. Really interesting little animals. One thing that's characteristic of many geckos, of course, is their eyes. And they have these big eyes, which make them such cute little animals. This is a Sleven sand gecko. And most geckos are nocturnal. We'll meet some in a moment which are not, but most are nocturnal, which means that they need to have these big eyes so that they get good vision at nighttime to see their prey and to potentially see predators coming as well. And the pupil of the eye in the nocturnal ones is vertical. And as you can see, it's got sort of almost pinholes. So when you're not shining a torch on it or flashing it with a camera, the pupil opens wide, almost till it's circular, kind of covering most of the eye, to let the maximum amount of light into the retina, so that it's got good night vision. But when you shine a torch on it or you flash it with your camera, then that pupil will close almost to a slit with just some pinholes. It can still see, but it protects the delicate retina behind it. This is the Sabka sand gecko. As you can see, it's also got an eye. This one's quite closed, and you can see it's got a very different shaped kind of face with nostrils sticking up quite high in this species. Here is another Sleven sand gecko portrait. Beautiful, beautiful animals. So moving from the sand geckos and into another family, the Phylodactyly, or leaf-toed geckos, we have a range of these here, and this is one of my favorite genera of geckos here. They live in the mountains. There's actually a paper which was just published last week, I think, from Iran about this genus of geckos, Aesacus, and they have found a load more species. So when I first came to Arabia, to Oman, in fact, we thought that there were just 2 species in Oman. But over the years since then, over the last 25 years or so, the number of species has increased and increased as we found new ones, and particularly recently with the work of Johannes and his co-workers looking at genetics, has shown that some of the things we thought were just one species are now divided into several species. This one, Aesacus gallagheri, named after Michael Gallagher, who was the founder of the Oman Natural History Museum. It was actually first found in Masafi, the type specimen, if you like, the first one that was ever found. But it's quite common species really throughout the Hajar Mountains, or at least the UAE Hajar Mountains, and into the Western Hajar in Oman. If you go further over, there's actually a different species now. And it's one of the few geckos which has sexual dimorphism, color dimorphism. So the male has got the yellow tail, and the female has got the black and white tail. So it's very easy to tell the sex of these ones. Many geckos, it's quite difficult to tell, but these guys, they're easy. small species, lives on cliffs and boulders and rocks in the mountains and the wadis. This one, Gardner's leaf-toed gecko, which I have to thank, again, Johannes for actually naming this after me. Yeah, very honored for that. It was quite a surprise. But this one is quite a common species in the UAE and in the Musandam Mountains as well. It's larger than Gallagher's one. You can see it curls its tail horizontally like a watch spring. A few of the Aesacus do that. And it's got very long legs. And these geckos have twin adhesive toe pads on twin pads on each toe. And they're actually really good at climbing. With these long legs and their sticky toes, they can leap from boulder to boulder over long distances and just stick on and run up them. So they're very, very good climbers indeed. It's the geckos which have these little twin toe pads on each toe. It's recently been postulated that the reason for that is that some of the species live in areas which are quite dusty. And dust, of course, on sticky toe pads makes it more difficult to climb. So they can actually lift the toe pads and just use the claw in between to climb on if the toe pads are not being useful. This one is Margarita's leaf-toed gecko, which is a much more rare one, but it's found in the UAE mountains in a few locations. It's got rather shorter legs, if you can see, than the one you just saw, Gardner's one. But otherwise, it looks quite similar, as does the Emirates leaf-toed gecko, which Johannes talked about, the endemic one here. This one was named after Margarita Metalanu, who was a PhD student in Spain, studied and did a lot of the genetics work on the geckos here in the UAE and in Arabia. Very sadly, tragically, she was actually killed while doing field work by an elephant in Africa. But her name lives on in this species. And then we have the fan-footed geckos, of which we have two species here in the UAE, one in the Musandam area in Ras Al Khaimah and one in the rest of the Hajr Mountains. And they have also two sort of divided pads on each toe, but the scales underneath are arranged in sort of a fan shape. And Teodactylus actually means in Greek, means fan fingers. Interesting, this one actually, I took this photograph on Jebel Faya, which is a mountain near, kind of on the Dubai Sharjah kind of border. It's in Sharjah, I think, isn't it? Jebel Faya, I think. And quite interesting, when I took this photograph, I climbed up the mountain and was photographing them on a cliff, kind of quite high up in the mountain, obviously having a flash like that. And so when I came down the mountain, I didn't think anything of it. I just climbed down, carrying on with my camera and stuff. And two land cruisers came straight at me and pinned me in their headlights. And guys with guns jumped out and pointed them at me. And the only time it's ever happened to me here. And it was just after 9/11, so everyone was a bit jumpy. And the guys came up to me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Photographing animals, geckos. You don't see my camera." And they said, "Oh, okay, oh." And I said, what was the problem? And they said, "Well, we didn't know who you were. We saw this thing flashing in the mountain, and we were scared. We thought maybe it was Al-Qaeda or something." So I'm glad you didn't shoot first. You asked questions first. Anyway, aside from that, the next group of geckos we have are in the Spherodactylidae, a different one. And these include the semaphore geckos. And this one, again, is a very unusual looking gecko. It's Brachyurus carteri. It's within the UAE, it's critically endangered, but only because it's found in a very, very small space. And they haven't actually been back recently. It may even be extinct there, I'm not sure, because it was only literally about 1 square kilometer. On the Oman border, kind of near Jebel Hafid. But it's found throughout Oman. This is a kind of its distribution in Oman. And you can see it just reaches the UAE. When we found this, we were really surprised, actually, because we had no idea that this came anywhere near the UAE. But I was doing a survey within Oman, but right on the UAE border, and we found these geckos and said, oh, well, if they're here, they've got to be in the UAE as well. So we went round to the other side of the border, and sure enough, we found a few there as well. This is the female of Carter's semaphore gecko. And it's an interesting one because it actually seems to be active both at day and at night. If you go out in the middle of the day, even in temperatures like today, you can find it out on a rock, standing around, not in full sun. Yeah, they're really hardy, tough little animals. But if you go out at night, you can find them active as well, just climbing around. So I don't know when they sleep. I think it's a species which really deserves to have someone do a really good detailed study on them. But we have a few other semaphore geckos. This is the rock semaphore gecko. This one you can find in Abu Dhabi city. And in fact, this next picture, that's in my garden in Mushrif. They're not native, if you like, to Abu Dhabi city and Dubai city and so on, because it's a mountain species and lives naturally in rocky areas in the mountains. But it's sort of, it must have been brought over, I guess, in quarried rocks or something, and it's adapted itself to living in the urban environment to a certain extent as well. This one is a bar-tailed semaphore gecko. This is a mountain species. In the mountains, it becomes the most common species, particularly in the Musandam region or the mountains in Ras Al Khaimah, where they're pretty common. This one's lost half its tail, but they have a very long tail, which can be strongly barred in black and white. This one isn't particularly. And this one is the dwarf semaphore gecko, which is a tiny little species, probably our smallest gecko, I think. Again, these semaphore geckos are mostly diurnal, so these guys are active in the daytime. Tiny little one. You find it in sandy areas in Abu Dhabi and also into Dubai as well. And finally, the last gecko I want to talk about is the wonder gecko, or the Persian wonder gecko, because it is, I think you'd agree that it's the most kind of colorful gecko we have. It's the largest gecko species that we have. It looks very different from the other geckos, and it's also critically endangered. The reason it's so critically endangered is because its habitat has, it's lost a lot of its habitat because its natural area here in the UAE was from about Abu Dhabi's airport up to maybe Al Quwain, in that kind of coastal desert. And it does go inland a bit as well, but the main bulk of it was in the coastal desert. So somewhere like the Maktoum airport, for example, and Jebel Ali was a place where there was really good populations of these geckos. That's where I always used to go to look at them. But of course, that population, a lot of it has lost its habitat, and some of it now you can't get into because it's within the airport area. There used to be a population just near Al Reef village, just in that patch of desert there. But I've looked a couple of times recently and I can't find any of them. So I think they've probably been lost from that area because it's so disturbed. There's people all over it and rubbish and car tracks and so on. So I think the closest populations are a little bit further north, and you do get it in kind of near Gantut and places. But it's a big gecko, really beautiful. It has some unusual features. One of them is it has skin autotomy, which means it has a very fragile skin. So if you try to pick it up and just grab it, for example, it can twist inside your hand and shed its skin like this. Now, this is probably a good escape mechanism. I mean, many geckos shed their tails if the tail's grabbed, but this shedding the skin is probably a good one. If a bird, for example, pecks it, it can shed that skin and still escape. But if you hold it in your hand and it sheds too much skin, it's likely to not recover from that. So, beautiful animals. I think that's the end of my talk. So I think we'll answer questions.
Yes, and we will just move the chairs. I'll get it. And then you can prepare your questions. Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to ask, are there any facilities currently making anti-venom for the venomous snake species here?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
So there's no anti-venom for any of the species manufactured in the UAE specifically. There's only a regional or Arabia one anti-venom that's been used from Saudi Arabia. And that includes only one species that really covers it, and that's the sand viper. But for the saw-scale vipers and the Hajar saw-scale viper, there's no anti-venom that specifically covers that. So that's part of the research that's ongoing, is to look at venom variation, because obviously the anti-venom is being manufactured at the moment, is produced from venoms from a species that is not currently included. So that's future work that's looking into seeing what anti-venom actually will work for some of the species, and also to follow up what is a priority and if it's required.
I think it's probably true to say, though, that the anti-venom, which is stocked by hospitals here, is quite effective against viper bites, including the saw-scale vipers. Wouldn't be, I mean, I'm sure it's not as effective as if it's made specifically for the species from here, because venoms in snakes tend to be quite geographically variable, even within a species. So the more kind of local, if you like, the manufacturer is using, probably the higher the efficacy. But certainly if you do get bitten by a viper, there are anti-venom treatments here which do seem to work reasonably well.
Thank you. Question at the back, over there. Yeah, at the back.
Hello? Yes. My question is for Dr. Gardner. Yeah, since you focused on UAE reptiles. Actually, I am waiting for you to focus or discuss on the spiny-tailed lizard or the Eurymastix aegyptia. So, sir, would you please discuss if you have information regarding its habitats, common habitats, as well as its behavior and response to anthropogenic activities?
Ooh, that's a big question. As we have two subspecies of spiny-tailed lizards here in the UAE. As Johannes mentioned, we have the small-scaled one, which is Eurymastix aegyptia microlepis, which is found really probably from about the Abu Dhabi Al Ain Road and westwards, and then as you go northwards, we have the other subspecies, which is leptini. But they look very similar, and you can't really easily tell them apart unless you count the scales. These are large lizards. For those who don't know, they're sort of this sort of size. They're vegetarian almost exclusively, and they live generally on sand plains or flat areas between sand dunes and so on, where they dig burrows. Those burrows can be, particularly when they're dug into the compacted sandstone, aeolianite, they probably used for centuries, I think, the same burrows. Individuals move around between burrows, so they don't necessarily always stay in the same burrow, they move. When it comes to human things, obviously if the area is going to be developed as a housing estate or a golf course or an industrial area, those poor geckos really are, there's not much you can do for them. When the bulldozers move in, they go down their burrows and they get squashed, presumably, or, that's the end of them. Mm. There have been, both in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, for example, programs to try to move them, to relocate them as a way of saving them. I'll put in, because the problem is most reptile translocations like that are not successful. So you can collect them up. I've done this as well. I've been paid to do it on 1 or 2 occasions, but it's a pretty thankless task, I think. You can fairly easily catch them, and you can move them to somewhere else. You can dig an artificial burrow for them. They won't stay in it. They'll dive into it, but they won't be there the next day. But the problem is how, if it's an area where these lizards should naturally live, you would already find a population there anyway, which may be at carrying capacity. You can't just keep putting in more and more animals there and expect them to be able to survive long term. After rain, when there's lots of food, maybe they can live for some time, but as soon as you get a dry period and there's, the amount of food disappears and so on, most of those animals are going to die. And the problem is there's been very little follow-up and monitoring of such relocated populations. So people have done this. They've even put in pit tags to kind of identify them. But unless somebody's actually going to catch them again, and which is another stressful thing for the lizard, nobody really knows what happens. And I suspect they're not successful.
So, sir, basically, if their habitat is already degraded, or, for example, there will be a development in their habitat, so basically, there's nothing we can do because they are very specific on their habitats. Yeah, because I think one of the reasons of the decline of their population is the habitat degradation, and of course, I think some people eat that lizard as well. Yeah.
Traditionally, they have been eaten. I don't think anybody in UAE is still eating them, or very, very rarely. Saudi Arabia, a bit more so. I think there have been cases. There's a famous picture, which you may have seen, of a pickup truck piled high with dead spiny-tailed lizards. Apparently, the hunters who collected those did get prosecuted and were jailed for a while. Because they are protected species. But I don't think hunting, certainly here hunting, I found snares outside them, so it does happen, but I think it's mostly habitat loss is the main threat.
Thank you. All right, we have one question here. And yes, we didn't talk about that, just a side question, I guess. The main threat for reptiles here in the region, habitat loss?
Habitat loss.
Yes.
Habitat loss, definitely.
All right.
My question is, are lizards and geckos the same? And if they're not, what's the difference?
That's a good question, and it's I think the answer maybe doesn't make that much sense to you, but basically, geckos are a kind of lizard. So lizards are a group of animals which include geckos, and they include skinks, which are those like the sandfish, for example, and it includes monitor lizards and a whole range of different kinds of lizards. There are many different families of lizards, and the geckos are a kind of lizard.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. There was one question behind.
Hi. I want to know what the average lifespan of a gecko and the average lifespan of a snake are, or if it varies depending on the species of the gecko or the snake.
I'm sure it does depend on the species. That some will be quite long-lived. Those big spiny tail lizards that we were just talking about, those ones probably, you know more about this than I do, so I should probably shut up, but I would guess they live for about 20 years or something.
Yeah, they go
roughly.
over 25 years to 30 years and older. And so, yeah, they're
The little
long
geckos,
lifetimes.
much less than that, I think.
Well, the exceptions are the wonder geckos as well. They extend well over 17 years. That's so depends on the species, so some can live quite long. Snakes, we have snakes in the wildlife center now that's over 20 years old. There's several snakes recorded over 40 years old as well. So certain species can live longer than others as well, and that's lots to do with their reproductive cycles as well, that determines if it's a short-lived or more longevity as well.
And would a smaller gecko live longer or
I think
less
the smaller ones
than-
would live shorter.
Shorter.
And in the wild, of course, because there's predation and there may not be any food when hasn't rained for a long time and so on, the actual lifespan is probably much less than they are in captivity, where they're looked after and they get plenty of food and no predators.
Thank you. Okay, we had one last question. One last question? Oh, okay. All right. I think, Oscar? Okay.
Yeah, I don't need this or a mic. Yeah, I have a question. Can you tell us a little more about how snake venom works and how the anti-venom works? More chemistry about it.
Want to do that? Yeah.
I do, yeah. Okay, well, Drew, I think we can combine it. So the first step in anti-venom production is extracting venom from snakes. And what they do is they look at, in the region, what is the snakes that's normally responsible for most of the snake bites. And a selection of those different species will be used, which they will extract the venom from. It will be dried, and eventually it basically will be injected into horses. Very low quantities. The horses builds up immunity from it, and then eventually basically the antibodies from the horse will be received, from which then they develop antivenom. It sounds a bit simple, but what they also look is when they're using a range of different venoms from certain snakes, they look at the different proteins within the venoms, what is compatible. And that will then form what they call a polyvalent. So they look at venoms that's very much similar, that is compatible, that will then neutralize a range of symptoms. Venom from snakes, to break it down, most people will talk about cytotoxic venom, neurotoxic venom, or hemotoxic venom. And that's just a way to communicate with people in general and what is the symptoms that's actually caused. But each of the snake venoms, a snake, for example, like the Arabian cobra, the black desert cobra, which is a neurotoxic largely, so venom that causes your neurological system to shut down. Also got cytotoxic venoms, also got hemotoxic venoms within that. And it's just what shows symptoms. And it's a whole cocktail of different proteins that react. But we just group it, obviously, neurotoxic on the main clinical symptoms that shows. So it's really complex, and there's a lot of studies been done. And as Drew touched as well, within a species, you will also get variation in the venom. And that's why there's lots of research happening within the region, also internationally, as snakebite has been considered as one of now neglected tropical disease. And it's to actually study and see which antivenoms work, are they really effective, and then testing venoms of different species, and also within the species over the entire range to improve antivenoms. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult thing to do, because a lot of people also get bitten by, for example, the saw scale vipers, but they're not, didn't have any venom injected, so there's no symptoms that develop. You will also have people that might have allergic reactions to the venom in smaller quantities. So there's lots of variables then to determine what is the actual symptoms that will occur into a person. So as Drew also said, with some of the saw scale vipers, yes, there's only a single species. They are treatment, But we are also unsure, for example, the echis that we got in the country, the small-scale viper, most of the bites that we see is localized swelling, but people are treated with anti-venom. Is the anti-venom actually working, or were the venom actually in the first place not that life-threatening and that it required anti-venom therapy? That's what they're doing a lot of research on now, is to see which anti-venoms is actually truly effective for neutralizing the venom. That's based on a lot of the patients that goes into the hospitals and that receive large quantities of anti-venom. And that's basically, again, coming back onto the different snakes that they use. And you basically get in a fraction of the different proteins that's in there that neutralize the venom and stop the effects of breaking down your cells and your body. So they're looking at, is that actually they're neutralizing it? Because if you inject in anti-venom into someone, which should always be done under medical supervision, so you cannot just go and inject yourself with anti-venom if you're in the field. If large doses are required, it means normally then the anti-venom potentially is not very good in neutralizing that particular snake's venom. And that sparks normally, especially if there's lots of patients being bitten, for example, in Africa with mambas or buffaloes, in this region in particular, we'll look at things like the sand vipers, and then Arabian cobras in Saudi as well.
All right. Wow. This was quite comprehensive response. Thank you. All right. Well, I think it's time to stop, even though we could speak about reptiles much longer. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Johannes, for coming and talking to us about reptiles tonight. Thank you for coming. Have a great summer. We will have the next science talk on the 29th of August, and we will talk about fish. All right. So see you then. Thank you.